this special episode of Interpreting India. I'm your host, Srinath Raghavan, and today we are discussing the increasingly fraught relationship between China and India. 2022 has been a year of geopolitical conflict and tensions. If we were expecting a quieter end to the year, then apparently we were mistaken. On 9th December, Chinese and Indian troops had a face-off along the line of actual control in the Tawang sector of Arunachal Pradesh. While we don't have many details yet, it appears that a few hundred soldiers were involved in a physical scuffle and some 30 to 40 on both sides sustained injuries. The Indian Defence Minister, Mr. Rajnath Singh, told the parliament that the Chinese People's Liberation Army troops had tried to transgress the LAC in this area and were prevented from doing so. 2 days after this incident, the local commanders of the Indian Army and the PLA met to discuss the issue, though it is unclear what, if anything, has been agreed upon to restore tranquility. The relations between India and China have been in deep freeze since May 2020, when troops of both sides had clashed along the LAC in Ladakh. The two sides have since enhanced their military deployment and upgraded their logistical infrastructure along the line of actual control. Arunachal Pradesh has several points where the two sides have different perceptions of where the line of actual control runs, and both sides patrol up to the line that they claim. With reference to the recent standoff, the Indian Ministry of Defence has noted that this has been the case in the Tawang sector since 2006. How do we understand China's posture and actions along the LAC in recent years? Is a purely bilateral framework adequate to grasp Beijing's motivations? Or are larger considerations at work? And what are India's options in dealing with Chinese activism along the line of actual control? Joining me today to discuss this topic is Ambassador Vijay Gokhale. Ambassador Gokhale is a non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie, India. He retired from the Indian Foreign Service in January 2020 after a diplomatic career spanning 39 years. He has served both as the Foreign Secretary of India and as India's ambassador to China. Indeed, he is one of our foremost experts on China and on the disputed boundary. Ambassador Gokhale is the author of 3 books: Tiananmen Square, The Making of a Protest, The Long Game, How the Chinese Negotiate with India, and most recently, After Tiananmen, The Rise of China. In an interesting coincidence, just as the news of the recent face-off hit the headlines a couple of days ago, Carnegie India published an important paper by Ambassador Gokhale titled A Historical Evolution of China's India Policy, Lessons for India-China Relations. While much has been written about India-China relations, most of this tends to be from the perspective of India. We have few assessments of how Beijing has seen India and has sought to deal with it. You can access this excellent paper on our website, and we will be talking about the longer arc of China's policy towards India, which Ambassador Gokhale has traced in the paper. Ambassador Gokhale, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Srinath.
Sir, I want to begin really with the headlines of the moment, really. I know that it's difficult to make inferences based on the limited amount of information that is available in the public domain. But you have not only studied this issue very extensively, but have dealt with it through the course of your diplomatic career at so many different levels. So I would really like to sort of get your perspectives on, not so much on what might have happened along the line of actual control in Tawang, the incident that was reported from 9th of December, but also about the importance of that particular sector, because over the last couple of years, I think a lot of our attention has been engaged on the Ladakh sector, particularly in the aftermath of the Galwan crisis of 2020. We have seen considerable amounts of military deployment and focus on that particular region. But Arunachal Pradesh has historically been one of the more troubled sort of areas between India and China. So I would just like your reflections to begin with on how you read what is currently playing out on the ground.
Yeah, thank you, Srinath. I followed the developments that have taken place since the 9th of December quite carefully, particularly whatever has been reported in the media. Now, I think it is important to understand that the line of actual control, which runs all the way from the Union Territory of Ladakh in the northwest to the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh in the southeast, has never been defined as a common line between the two countries. In other words, each side has its own perception of the line of actual control. And what we have seen from the year 2008 onwards are steady attempts by the Chinese to push against this line of actual control with a view to reaching the points along the line which they state are on the line of actual control. So particularly in 2013 and from 2013 onwards, there has been a series of escalating incidents. In the Western sector, we saw the last such incident at Tawang. This does not mean, however, that there are no differences on the LAC perception in the other two sectors, namely the middle sector, which covers the states of Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand and Sikkim, and the eastern sector, which covers the state of Himachal Pradesh. Arunachal Pradesh. Now, in the case of Arunachal Pradesh, Srinath, it is important to understand one fact. The McMahon line, which both sides agree is the line of actual control in that sector, there is a difference of opinion as to the precise alignment of this line. As far as India is concerned, the McMahon line is the line which runs along the highest watershed of the Himalayas in Arunachal Pradesh. For the Chinese, however, the McMahon line is the line that was drawn on the map by British Foreign Secretary Henry McMahon, and not necessarily running along the highest ridge line, but in a literal interpretation of where that line lies on the map. And as a result of this, there are some areas along the border in Arunachal Pradesh where there is a significant difference in the alignment of the line of actual control. My sense is that the current impasse at Yangtze is one of those areas where the alignment differs. And therefore, we have seen a Chinese attempt to push into this region with a view to reaching its own alignment. And we have seen a pushback from the Indian side. But before I conclude, Srinath, I need to make one further point. And that is that ever since the current leader has taken over in China, he has been emphasizing the importance of military training for troops in preparation by getting near combat training. In other words, training in near combat conditions. And particularly after 2020, orders to this effect have been issued by President Xi Jinping. This has resulted in troops along our border, the Chinese troops along our border, trying to press forward and meeting resistance or a counter response from the Indian side. And therefore, you saw what happened in Galwan, and now we are hearing of what happened in Yangtze.
Sure, sir. And Tawang also seems to be politically an important sort of sensitive area as far as the boundary dispute between India and China goes. I mean, the Chinese have overtly laid claim to that particular area, but it is an area which I don't think any Indian government can ever sort of concede will be even remotely sort of plausible to give it away to the Chinese, because we have political representation of Tawang. And also, when I was in the army visiting Tawang, I used to be struck by the fact that, local school children would speak Hindi. So Tawang is highly integrated into India. So I'm just wondering, what is the political salience of this particular issue, or is it just an operational question at play out here?
For the Chinese, I think there is a deep political significance. And that significance lies in the fact that the sixth Dalai Lama was supposedly born in Tawang. Now, subsequently, the Chinese narrative is that since the sixth Dalai Lama was born in Tawang, and because on and off Tibetan monasteries exercise their control, ecclesiastically speaking, over this region, that therefore Tawang is a part of Tibet and therefore a part of the People's Republic of China. This is not necessarily supported by the available documentation, but this is the Chinese claim. And therefore, even in 1960, when Premier Chou En-lai visited India in an attempt to find a solution to the boundary question, the one particular place he mentioned in the eastern sector was Tawang. That should indicate to us how significant this particular town or area is in the Chinese psyche in terms of the boundary.
Right. Now, one of the very important points that you make in your recently published Carnegie paper, and I'd urge all our listeners to go to the website and access the paper there, is the importance of trying to understand China's policy towards India in the longer sort of historical arc. But one of the main arguments that you advance there is that if we really want to understand how China looks upon India and has dealt with it over several decades now, in many ways, we have to understand that China looks at India within a larger geopolitical or a geostrategic framework. And that if we are not able to understand that particular framework, we will not be able to reconstruct what motivates China's policy towards India, whether in the past or in the present and future. So maybe could you just lay out what the broad argument is, and then we can go through some of the very interesting arguments, smaller arguments that you make there.
Yeah, thank you. Srinath, if you look at the way in which China has conducted relations with India, in terms of what their leaders have said about India-China relations or what their scholars have said about India-China relations, then it becomes quite clear from the writings that are available with us that they have looked at India through the lens of their own relations with other great powers. And historically, from 1949, they have claimed that only two other countries have great power status like them. One is the Soviet Union and its successor state, the Russian Federation, and the other is the United States of America. And essentially, Chinese foreign policy from Mao Zedong to Xi Jinping has been crafted within this triangular balance of great power relations. In this triangular balance, India is not, in the Chinese mind, a separate pole. It is an adjunct power, a power that becomes of concern to the Chinese side when, by association with another great power, it appears to threaten Chinese interest. And therefore, as a result of this perception about India, the Chinese judge India's actions based on whether they help China's cause and objectives or they hinder China's cause and objectives. Now, China's objectives, of course, are different from Mao to Xi. That's obvious because China's comprehensive national strength has also grown substantially. But the way in which they judge India's actions have remained more or less consistent because they place India within the framework of this triangular great power relationship and look upon India as an adjunct power that either tilts towards the Soviet Union or tilts towards the United States. And the whole objective of the Chinese side is to ensure that India remains as neutral as possible, so that its capacity to harm China's strategic objectives is minimized.
Sure. And you divide up the sort of longer arc of India-China relations in the post-colonial period primarily into three broad phases. And the first phase is really, practically covers the period from 1949 to 1960 or thereabouts, where you say that China's primary sort of focus there was with the United States of America, and that India then comes to be seen within that particular view. And it seems to me that just to link up the history and the present, that Tawang itself is an interesting example of that particular dynamic, though, you don't use it as an example as such in your book. Because, when Indian sort of administration was being extended throughout this area, the British did not have administrative sort of posts, etc. When Indian administration was first extended into this area in 1951, when, permanent sort of establishments were set up, the Chinese actually never responded at all. They neither protested nor made any of these claims, all of which were subsequently made. But at that point of time, they were not. And it seems to me that that was partly because of their ongoing conflict with the United States in the context of the Korean War and the role that they perceived of India.
Yes, well, that's partly the answer, Srinath, but it also is a fact that the new Chinese authorities, the People's Republic of China, really had no in-depth knowledge of the India-Tibet boundary. And it took them a few years, and by going through the records of the Tibetan state and the Dalai Lama's office, to realize that there was a significant difference in the perceptions of the two sides on the alignment of the boundary. Until that understanding was gained, the Chinese therefore dissimulated. And in some cases, it was sheer ignorance, as a result of which they did not protest or did not state their claims. Nonetheless, as soon as they became aware that there were Tibetan claims which they could also automatically buy into, we therefore see thereafter repeated references to the eastern sector and to Tawang in particular. Now, of course, one of the big concerns in the 1950s, and that concern again is reflected today, is the possibility of American involvement in this region as part of their containment of China strategy. To my mind, this is more imagined or contrived than real. But of course, a lot of diplomacy and national security is on the basis of perception and not necessarily on the basis of facts. And because the southwestern border of China is so vulnerable as a result of the fact that even 60 years after they have occupied Tibet, the Dalai Lama continues to be a revered figure, they continue to remain concerned about the possibility that a third party will utilize this vulnerability to gain advantage from the Chinese. So in a sense, there is not only the boundary question, but also, again, because India is placed in the framework of this great power, balance of power game, there is also the question of how and who is going to use India in order to hurt China. When these two come together, you begin to understand why the Chinese react in what I would call a rather paranoid fashion when it comes to their southwestern border.
Sure. That's a very interesting argument because, in India, we have this perception, not just amongst, I think, scholars and historians, but also among ordinary people, that in a sense, non-alignment or the pursuit of strategic autonomy has somehow been inherent to India's engagement with the world. But you are suggesting that the Chinese have never really bought into that particular picture.
Well, Mao was very clear, very specific about this. He, in fact, in 1949 said, there is no third road. You either lean to the side of socialism, which is the Soviet Union, or you lean to the side of imperialism, which is the United States and the West. And therefore, in his mind, non-alignment might have sounded good in theory, but in practice, India, he felt, was aligned, at least in the early parts, until the mid-1950s, very clearly with the United States and Great Britain and against the Soviet Union. A non-alignment has never been a credo that the Chinese have ever sort of bought into, simply because they play a classic balance of power game. And in a classic balance of power game, whether you are a pole or you are an adjunct power, you play one side or the other. You cannot remain neutral in this game. And therefore, it's a concept they cannot wrap their heads around.
And the second sort of period into which you divide this longer history is the period between 1960 and the end of the Cold War. When you say that in some ways the main concern for China geopolitically was the former Soviet Union, which was at one point, especially in the first phase, a very close ally of China. But in this interim period of about close to 30 years, between 1960 and 1990 or thereabouts, the Soviet Union starts to loom very large in China's geopolitical concerns. Could you explain a little bit about what changes and how does India's role accordingly then change as far as the Chinese are concerned?
So I think after the 1962 conflict, the relations between India and China went into the deep freeze for many years, largely because China itself was undergoing a lot of internal problems as a result of the Cultural Revolution, but also because India was not willing to engage with China after the 1962 conflict. And therefore, until the late 1960s, there was no serious effort by either side to rebuild that relationship. However, from 1969 onwards, when the Sino-Soviet split became public and China grew anxious about a possible Soviet attempt to use force against it, the efforts by the Indian side to build relations with the Soviet Union were again seen by China purely from the balance of power perspective, rather than from the Indian perspective. So far as India was concerned, we were facing a crisis of our own in South Asia, the Bangladesh crisis of which you have written so brilliantly about. And therefore, our concern was about balancing the United States, which was increasingly tilting towards Pakistan, It made sense, therefore, for India to reach out to the other superpower, the Soviet Union. But from China's perspective, this reaching out magnified the Soviet threat. It was concerned that the Soviets were not only aligned along their entire northern and northwestern border, but would now have an ally, at least in their minds, we were an ally, along the entire southwestern border. And therefore, it was a virtual surrounding of China on land by either the Soviet Union or its allies and partners. As a result of this sense of concern or fear or paranoia, whatever you might call it, China was made every effort after 1975 to try to dilute the Indo-Soviet relationship. And one of the main points I make in my paper is that when a second offer was made by the Chinese side to resolve the boundary issue in 1980, the first being by Zhou Enlai in 1960, it was not driven by bilateral considerations. It was essentially driven by expectation that they would be able to use this to wean us away from the Soviet Union and thereby dilute the threat. And I conclude this particular section by saying that once the Soviet threat appeared to diminish in 1985, after Gorbachev became the Soviet leader and indicated his desire to improve relations with China, we also see a consequent waning of enthusiasm on the Chinese side to settle the boundary question. And it is around this time, according to writings by many of the Indian diplomats involved at that time, in particular Ambassador Shamsaran, that there is also a change that we notice about Chinese claims on the boundary. And the shift in position when the Chinese now begin to say that it is the eastern sector which is the area of primary dispute and not the western sector.
And the eastern sector is, of course, Arunachal Pradesh, which is the location of the current standoff.
That's right.
Right. But by the end of the 1980s, both China and India are in effect, grappling with the new world. The communist bloc in Eastern Europe has crumbled. No one knows that the Soviet Union is going to collapse, but it's definitely a much weakened superpower in as much as they're embroiled in its own problems with Afghanistan, etc. So what is shaping China's attitudes towards not just India, but the rest of the world? And then within that framework, where does India come in?
I think the real window of opportunity to build that relationship was between 1988 and 1998. Because the end of the Cold War brought enormous challenges both to India and to China in terms of our foreign policies. After all, we had only ever been existing as independent nations in the Cold War period. And now we were faced with the unipolar world where there was only one power, and that was the United States of America. Therefore, it made sense for each of these two countries to improve relations with the other, so that at least collectively there could be an effort to build a world order in which there might be some balance to the United States. This is therefore the period when both China and India start talking of a new international political and economic order. And China starts talking of an Asian century where India and China will march together to ensure common prosperity. Tragically, however, what happened was that during this period, the attention of both India and China turned westward because the economic benefits could only come from the West. And both India and China needed technology, it needed capital, it needed talent to grow the economy. So in a sense, while it made larger strategic sense for India and China to align their foreign policies, in practical terms, they seemed to fall off each other's radar at that time, since both pursued relations or prioritized relations with the West. And in that sense, in this period, all we could achieve and did achieve was peace and tranquility in the border areas. And I do not wish to minimize the importance of what was achieved. It brought a quarter century of relative tranquility and peace to both sides, allowed both of us to focus both on domestic issues and on the economic problems. And to a certain extent, the rise of both China and India was because at least partly because of the peace that prevailed. Unfortunately, after the year 2000, not only was China's economic growth much faster, but also the world returned much more to a balance of power game than it had in 1990, because Russia was back under President Putin, and China was more confident because of its economic growth. And therefore, once the triangular relationship came back into existence, the importance of India again relatively declined. And therefore, my own hypothesis is that we see a worsening of India-China relations after 2005, as China becomes more confident in the new balance of power that has emerged in the 21st century.
Sure. And then the period just before 2005, 2003 and 4, you do see some degree of forward movement, particularly on the sort of contested boundary question, because that's the time when Prime Minister Vajpayee visits Beijing, and the Chinese, suggest that they should think about a kind of a political settlement. And I think that's the first time that India actually sort of agrees that we will take an overall approach and come up with a political this thing. A process is started with politically appointed special representatives to lead both sides' negotiation, and even a sort of a second stage agreement is signed in 2004 on the political parameters that would govern an eventual settlement. So there does seem to have been a bit of a moment of a flickering hope, but that gets extinguished rather quickly. And I was wondering why.
You must realize that the year 2003 was the year when Jiang Zemin was still the president of China. And for him, since he was president from 1989 until 2003, this was a period when he felt it was important that relations with India be normalized. It was also the time when China-Russia relations were just beginning to gain traction, the strategic partnership, and when China-US relations were still relatively stable, because China had successfully convinced the Americans to allow them into the WTO, and the Americans still believed they could convert China into a responsible stakeholder. So the international situation was still conducive to China trying to better its relations with other neighbors. After 2005, as tensions with the United States started to grow in the second Bush administration, and as they saw India perceptibly moving closer to the United States as a result of the 1-2-3 deal, much of that sense of expectation that they could resolve issues with India to their advantage began to dissolve. And by then, of course, China had new leaders. It had President Hu Jintao and Premier Wen Jiabao, and both of them were much more confident that China's rise was now inevitable. And therefore, their foreign policy itself was shifting away from the Deng Xiaoping maxim of hide your capabilities and bide your time to a more assertive foreign policy, which ultimately manifested itself under President Xi Jinping.
Sure. And how important was the global financial crisis of 2008 in this kind of Chinese calculus of how their own rise was playing out? You talk about a little bit in your latest book, After Tiananmen, about this particular period.
Well, there's no doubt now that the global financial crisis was seen by China as confirmation of their belief that the United States and the West were in a slow decline, and that the rise of China was now inevitable. Particularly the fact that they became the global engine of economic growth and, in a sense, rescued the world from a worse recession than we had to go through, was something which only reinforced their own belief about the superiority of their system, not just about their administration and policies, but about the communist system. And therefore, in a sense, China came out of the global financial crisis not only confident about its own abilities, but more confident about its role and place in the future world. And you therefore see from 2010 onwards a change in posture with the United States, a much more assertive behavior with the United States itself, a much more aggressive approach towards the American allies in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean, and a much more confident China dealing with its neighbors, which include us, of course.
Sure. And this is also the time when the United States starts talking more seriously about an Indo-Pacific kind of an approach. 2011 with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's famous sort of speech. And there is a sense now that China is kind of, in some ways, its actions are also having a little bit of a pushback from others. I mean, while the Chinese may believe that they are relatively stronger in a position to sort of assert their priorities and prerogatives, others are not willing to really play ball and go along with what China wants either.
Yeah, so I think the immediate aftermath of the end of the global financial crisis around 2010 was an aha moment for both sides. For the United States, it was a recognition that China was not, unfortunately, going to become the sort of stakeholder that they had hoped in a Western-led liberal order. But for China equally, there was the realization that however much they developed, however big a GDP they had, however much they assisted the United States, they would never be invited to the top table as an equal stakeholder. It would always be a Western-led order in which China might be tolerated, but would never be given decision-making powers. Now, as a result of this, of course, what you saw was a changing perception simultaneously in Beijing and Washington about the other side. This process, of course, took the whole of the second decade of this century because we had begun with admiration for the Chinese, with the way in which the Chinese had handled the global financial crisis, and to a certain extent, even gratitude that they had been able to pull the world out of it. And from that point on, there was a reevaluation which eventually culminated in the Trump administration's description of China as a strategic rival and a competitor, and in Xi Jinping's statements, not necessarily in public, that the United States is an existential threat to the Chinese Communist Party. So this was a journey of over 10 years. And it is a journey which has, in a sense, culminated in the post-COVID period with a clear recognition on both sides that the other is the pacing challenge. The United States, of course, has described China as the pacing challenge. But if you were to ask the Chinese side, that phrase would equally apply to their view of the United States.
Right. And throughout the past decade, this particular geopolitical sort of framework within which China has been conducting its foreign policy has clearly had an impact on relations with India because, these have had somewhat of a jagged trajectory. I think it's fair to say that from the Indian side, certainly from 2014, there has been a lot of effort to diplomatically reach out to the Chinese, including at very sort of important summit level meetings and so on. But the Chinese do not seem to have responded very positively to it, at least as far as the line of actual control and what seems to be happening on the ground is concerned, right? There is clearly a discrepancy between what the Chinese seem to be willing to consider at the higher political levels vis-a-vis what their actions on the ground are.
Yes, Srinath, that's a very appropriate description of the situation. So I can only conclude, therefore, that while we were hoping that there would be a bilateral relationship with China, through the second decade of this century, the Chinese will continue to look at India only from the prism of our relations with the United States. And as a result, despite every effort by the government of India to improve that relationship through various means, and one of them was high-level summits, there was no corresponding response from the Chinese side. In fact, on the Chinese side, there was a series of escalating incidents. And those were not limited simply to the line of actual control. This was also the period when they actively blocked India's membership of the Nuclear Suppliers Group, for example, when they repeatedly blocked Indian efforts to list terrorists in the 1267 Sanctions Committee, where they were unwilling to publicly endorse India's aspirations in the United Nations Security Council as and when it is expanded, and also seemed to be dismissive of India's concerns on some of the very sophisticated technology they were supplying to Pakistan, as well as the fact that the China-Pakistan economic corridor that runs through Pakistan-occupied Jammu and Kashmir actually changes the status quo in an area that India has claimed. To that extent, Chinese actions therefore eroded the feeling of trust that Indians had towards China. And the 2020 Galwan incident, to my mind, has put a final nail in that coffin. That is why in my paper I say that the Galwan incident was different from anything else, because the strategic ambiguity, that ambiguous view that most people had about India, has more or less disappeared. And I would say the vast majority have developed a certain amount of strategic clarity vis-a-vis China. I'm not saying that there are still not people who believe that we need to take a different approach, but I do not think in the current environment they would be able to voice their opinions. And even if they did voice those opinions, these would be treated as fringe opinions.
Sure. And it's also reasonably clear now that, India's kind of orientation towards the West, I don't think alignment is the right word, is pretty, clearly laid out. I think it definitely meets India's requirements in terms of what its own interests and equities are concerned in the region. And I think that course is now pretty well set. So given that, then I suppose the conclusion to be drawn is that in some ways we should expect more, lower level friction and perhaps, even other kinds of conflict spilling out to other kinds of areas and more diplomatic arenas as well. Because, it just is not in India's interest to dilute our relationship with the United States or with countries like Japan and Australia and other Southeast Asian countries simply to keep China in good humor.
So one of the presumptions in my paper is that India-China relations are likely to become more tense in general. And the situation along the line of actual control is likely to become therefore more combative, especially in the next 10 years. And I say especially in the next 10 years because in these 10 years, the actual gap between China and India will still be substantial. Let us not forget that China has an economy 6 times ours in size, and their military budget is at least 5 times what we spend. And therefore, what we are going to see is a situation of armed coexistence, which is here to stay, and pushing, shoving, and jostling along the line of actual control is one manifestation of that. That is, however, not the only manifestation. What we are also likely to see is the entry of the Chinese Navy and the Chinese military more generally into the Indian Ocean region, a situation that has not happened since the beginning of the 16th century. And that is consequently going to lead to a certain amount of pushing and shoveling and jostling in the Indian Ocean region as well. So we are going to have to deal with China both on our land frontier and in our maritime domain. And therefore, we are going to face a fairly complicated situation. And I think that I would certainly think the government is aware of that. And to a certain degree, the whole Indo-Pacific policy, our approach in giving focus to our coastal and maritime regions, our efforts to build partnerships, our developmental assistance to some of the littoral states close to us in the Indian Ocean region are all elements of a strategy to deal with what is likely to be a much more assertive China, both to our north and to our south.
Right. And at the same time, you also say that India has to be prepared for, more higher levels of risk management, so to speak, and that, some of these incidents, escalation control becomes important. So far, despite everything that has happened, we still see that some of the older protocols which were built into the agreements of the 1990s, which you referenced earlier, seem to be holding in a sense that there has not been any use of firearms and fatalities have happened, but they've not happened, because of use of military weapons, so to speak. Do you think these thresholds will be tested, given the sort of increasing points of friction, etc., as we go along?
Srinath, I would say that the 1993 and 1996 agreements are holding, but they are barely holding. Essentially, the spirit of the agreement was that there would be no face-offs, and that if face-offs happened, these would be resolved peacefully. What we have been seeing in the last few years is not only increasing face-offs, but face-offs that have resulted in physical combat. Now, although weapons may not have been used, if reports are to be believed that, for instance, at the Yangtze face-off on the 9th of December, the retreating Chinese forces fired weapons into the air, then it is only a matter of time before those weapons are leveled at their adversary. And therefore, I think these two agreements have outlived their use. And if they are barely holding, I think it points to the good sense on both sides. However, that doesn't mean that we continue to depend simply on these. And for that reason, I mentioned we have to move risk management from a tactical ground level to the political strategic level. And let me just outline what I meant by that. Firstly, I think we have to resume the political dialogue. As I wrote in my paper, two nuclear-armed neighbors and two of Asia's most populous countries and biggest economies cannot not speak to each other for 36 months. Let me be clear, I am not suggesting that the political dialogue should be at the heads of state or government. That is usually the end of the process. But I certainly think that the regular meetings between the foreign ministers and the national security advisors should resume. Because until that does, you cannot take the next step on risk management, which is to reiterate to the Chinese side that there are certain basic requirements for normal relations to prevail. Those being, or those including, that peace and tranquility must prevail along the line of actual control, that the trade imbalance is not sustainable and needs to be addressed, that stapled visas are not a sign of friendly relations and need to be resolved, and so on and so forth. So I would certainly say a resumption of political dialogue in some form and an iteration of the requirements for normal relations are part of risk management. I would also say that we have to address the deficiencies in bilateral border management framework, not only in terms of reworking these two agreements, because the fact is that these agreements don't cover new areas like drones, for instance, or even tanks close to the border, right? So we need to rework these agreements. But in addition to that, we need to establish an effective hotline between the theater commands so that if a situation escalates, the higher level can quickly establish contact. And we also need to create a secure political channel if it comes to that. And thirdly, of course, risk management also involves doing certain things domestically. The question is, have we taken specific policy steps to reduce dependence on Chinese imports? Because as I saw from the newspapers, a statement made by the Commerce Ministry in Parliament last week indicated that the trade deficit had gone up last year to $73 billion. And this year, in the first 7 months itself, it has crossed $50 billion. So what are the steps we are taking to reduce our dependence? That's one thing. The other is what are the steps we are taking to enhance our capacity to deter the People's Liberation Army along the LAC? That too is part of risk management, because unless we have a robust force, you cannot really communicate a robust counter response when it comes to that. And the last element of risk management, of course, is the Indo-Pacific agenda, the building of strong partnerships, the focus on ties with the littoral states in the Indian Ocean region, the building of a strong naval and coast guard force, and so on. So that's essentially what I mean by saying we cannot depend on the border peace and tranquility agreements. We need to move to the broader risk management.
Sure. And do you think China recognizes that some of this might also be in China's interest, despite continuing friction with India and so on?
I can't speak to that, Srinath, but what I can certainly surmise is that if we were signaling to the Chinese side that we would not resume the political dialogue unless they disengaged on the border, then the Yangtze incident suggests to me that they are not buying that line. That despite almost 36 months after Galwan, or 30 months after Galwan, they have tried another similar incident. Rather than disengaging, they seem to be re-engaging. So we need to take this into account. We need to, mine is just an off-the-cuff assessment. I'm sure government has far more resources and information. But it really needs to think what is the message that the Yangtze incident is conveying, not only in terms of the LAC, but the larger relationship.
That's right. And hopefully, given the range of diplomatic events that we are going to be involved in both countries, the G20 being hosted by India, the Chinese, I think, are going to host a BRICS summit, or at least it's slated at some point. So hopefully, space for diplomatic engagement will increase. I'm sure the government would have liked you very much within their sort of camp as these things were moving on. But we are very happy that you are out of it to be able to give us this perspective, which I think is quite unique. Just before we sign off, I'd like to say once again to our viewers that Ambassador Gokhale's work seems to me to be very important precisely because it is trying to understand China on its own terms, but from an Indian perspective. And I think that's been extremely rare. The 3 books that he has written, but also this article that he has written for Carnegie, I think are absolutely required reading. So those of you who are trying to make sense of what's happening now, instead of just following every news update that comes, I think it'll be useful to get this framework first into our heads so that we are able to understand what exactly motivates China today. Ambassador Gokhale, thank you so much for being with us today. It was a delight to speak to you.
Thank you, Srinath. Thank you very much.
We'll be back in January with a new season of Interpreting India. To make sure you don't miss it, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about our research and the team, you can visit us at carnegieindia.org. You can also find us on social media on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you for listening and see you next time.